Yes. Welcome. Hi, everyone, and thanks for coming to not your typical talk. And I'm going to correct myself because Joel said to me, I do have a graph I'm going to show. But in any case, let me tell you, I brought somebody for inspiration with me. Comes out of a conversation I had recently with Bob Holt. I rescued this photograph. It was about to be thrown out from the old seminar room, and this happens to be a photograph of the former chair of this department, a guy by the name of Warder Clyde Ali. And many of you may not know, Karen Bjorndal is smiling, that he was in fact instrumental in setting up the modern department. And I found it so sad and tragic and kind of funny at the same time that this photograph of him, which has been in the room 222 for years, I mean, I remember when I came here in 1988, was going to be thrown out by an ecologist. So in any case, history, we come from, we have a distinguished history in this department, and I think, yeah, and I really wish we would collect our papers and make sure that those of us who are senior in the room did not dispense of those things, and those of us who are junior try not to get rid of the elders because we don't know who they are. So in any case, thank you for coming, and let me introduce you to Joel Hagen, today's speaker. It's an absolute pleasure and an honor to introduce him. I followed Joel's work since I was a graduate student. Somebody asked me how I know him, and I said, well, I had to follow in his wake, quite literally, when I was writing my dissertation on Ledyard Stebbins. Joel is currently a professor in the biology department at Radford University. He actually served as chair of that department. And he teaches a staggering and has taught a staggering range of courses. And let me just quickly point out Principles of Biology, the Intro Bio course, Vascular Botany, General Botany, Ecology and Adaptation, Organismal Biology, Bioethics, and he has this really cool study abroad program in which he alternates the history of the Galapagos Islands with the biology of the Galapagos Islands. He obtained his undergraduate degree at St. John's University, one of these great, marvelous liberal arts schools. I've always admired that place. And he received an MA and a PhD from Oregon State University in the biological sciences. In 1982, he completed a dissertation on the history of plant biosystematics, and that's why I know him. He broke the ground and wrote really important papers for anybody who's interested in the history of plant systematics. The work is pioneering, and I will say that every time I get an interest to move into some area, Joel Hagen has already published something in it, including areas like the history of molecular anthropology, the history of the conflict between molecular and molecular biology as a new field, and organismal biology, of course, the history of plant taxonomy, and he's really best known for his work in the history of ecosystems ecology. Many of you have read An Entangled Bank, The Origins of Ecosystems Ecology. Joel has done a lot of work on people like Frederick Clemens and our own Odom. He's the one who writes all the dictionary entries on Odom. So in any case, I got very excited about his current project because I started reading up on it, and I said, my God, half of the people he's writing about have ties to the University of Florida. So that's why, and the title is Life Out of Balance, and it's a history of regulation. And think about this, how important mechanisms, the study of the mechanisms of regulation, whether it be in population biology, genetics, or in areas of physiology, for example, homeostasis. So he's going to give us a talk today, a chapter or two, a synthesis out of that current project, mostly on the history of physiological ecology of animals. Thank you so much, Joel. Welcome to UF.
Thanks, Ben. I want to talk about a problem that I think is kind of a general problem of how to unify biology, how to integrate the various disciplines that make up this very broad field. And I'm going to do that by talking about a specific historical episode surrounding this specialty, often referred to as physiological ecology, that developed strongly in the United States after World War II. And it was interdisciplinary in the sense that it was a combination of physiology, ecology, and also a lot of animal behavior. A variety of methodologies derived both from field natural history and laboratory physiology. Okay? And oftentimes taking laboratory methods out into the field or in very primitive sorts of laboratory settings. And I want to emphasize that it was also broadly evolutionary. These physiological ecologists were really interested in adaptation, and in particular how you take a generalized adaptation and specialize it for situations for living in what we would consider to be very harsh environments. It wasn't evolutionary in the sense of having a deep interest in evolutionary mechanisms, okay? Or in studying populations, or in being particularly interested in the process of speciation, for example. Okay? And so I just want to introduce a couple of characters that we'll come back to later in the talk. So this is Lawrence Irving, who was the chair of the Department of Biology at Swarthmore College. And Per Scholander, who was working in the laboratory of August Krogh in Denmark and immigrated to the United States right before the start of the war. Later became a naturalized citizen and married Irving's daughter. But the two of them spent several years before the United States entered the war writing some really seminal papers on the mammalian diving reflex, working primarily on seals, but also other marine mammals. And then when, after Pearl Harbor, Irving enlisted in the U.S. Army Air Force as, I think, a colonel, and somehow Scholander was also made an officer in the U.S. Army Air Force, even though he wasn't a U.S. Citizen. So during the war, he in particular was involved with doing applied physiological research, studying carbon monoxide poisoning in tents and developing protective clothing and whatnot. And after the war, for several years, Irving and Scholander turned their attention to Arctic biology and really kind of started that as a specialty, and were working in this physiological laboratory at Point Barrow, Alaska. I often show this slide to my friends in biology that complain about the limited cramped spaces that they have to do experimental research. So this was an old Quonset hut that was converted into a laboratory, and together Irving and Scholander and their laboratory group published a series of papers that on thermal regulation in Arctic animals that in some ways could be seen as a real foundation for physiological ecology more generally. Okay? Those papers also indirectly brought them into conflict with Ernst Mayr, one of the leading evolutionary biologists the 20th century. And I want to talk a little bit about that controversy. Again, certainly Meyer was interested in this problem of synthesis in biology. We associate him with the modern evolutionary synthesis. But his ideas on how to integrate disciplines and perspectives in biology was quite different from that of Scholander in particular, who he tangled with most directly, and also Irving and some of the other physiological ecologists. So with that in mind, just a very quick summary of the modern synthesis. So in one way, we can think of the modern synthesis as being a synthesis of Darwinian natural selection and Mendelian genetics. During the late 19th century and very early 20th century, these were seen as kind of competing theories, and due to the work of some prominent mathematical population geneticists that we've all heard about, it was shown that these two theories were not incompatible, but in fact that they formed an integral part of an understanding of evolution. And then we have a more diverse group of biologists that kind of solidified that synthesis, expanded it into a number of different fields, and really through the work of some prominent books that they read, kind of spread that synthesis a bit. So we can think of I think the modern synthesis in kind of a narrow sense of being the unification of Darwinism and Mendelism, but as Betty Smokovitis and a number of other historians have argued, this was also a much broader program of unification. Okay? And so you've all heard the famous admonition that Theodosius Dobzhansky had for high school science teachers, that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. Okay? But of course, the problem is how exactly do you do that in practice? And so I want to consider two alternative proposals that I'm not arguing are incommensurate with one another, but certainly emphasize different aspects of doing biology or scientific methodology. So one is one that I'm sure you're familiar with in one sense or another. Ernst Mayr wrote this very influential article called Cause and Effect in Biology that was published in 1961. And he asked this rhetorical question about bird migration. Okay? Why did the warbler migrate from Mayr's summer home on this particular date? And he said, a complete understanding of that phenomenon requires kind of four different forms of causation. So we can talk about proximate causes, the intrinsic physiological causes that would involve understanding hormones and the internal physiology of the bird. The extrinsic physiological cause being the temperature drop on August 25th that triggered the migratory behavior. And then we also have to consider ultimate causes. So there's a genetic program underlying the physiology of the bird that's been shaped by natural selection over time. And there's an ecological cause, and the warbler is an insect eater, and obviously migration is going to be necessary for survival and reproduction. Okay? And so in order to understand this biological problem, you have to put all four of those causes together. Common sense, I suppose, but also a little bit loaded. I mean, if you were making a name for yourself, would you like to be studying proximate causes or ultimate causes? I mean, he could have called them type 1 causes and type 2 causes, right? Okay. He makes another distinction that I think is perhaps even more problematic. He distinguishes between functional biology and evolutionary biology. And he goes so far as to say that they are largely separate fields, that individual scientists will work primarily in one or primarily in the other. In 1961, one might have thought that all biologists were evolutionary biologists. And so again, this is the rhetoric that he's using is making dichotomies and distinctions in kind of a loaded way, I would say. Now, Meyer says that you have to keep this outline in mind if you want to avoid fruitless controversies. So when people have mixed these levels of causation in their discussions of biology, what happens is there's a bunch of hand waving and screaming at one another. And so this is a way of kind of mentally organizing the problems in biology that will lead to kind of fruitful development of the field. But when you ask Meyer, how do you actually go about doing this? How do you unify biology or unify these two largely separate fields of biology? He gives a surprisingly weak answer. His answer is that the individual scientist needs to be broadly knowledgeable about all areas of biology. Okay. So historians have been really interested in this paper, I think for a number of reasons. I'm certainly not belittling this position, despite the problems that I see with it. Meyer was very concerned about the status of organismal biology at the time. Okay? And a number of historians have argued that this article was primarily a defense of organismal biology against the perceived influence of molecular biology in terms of funding and in terms of intellectual authority, in terms of department politics, all of which Meyer was very involved with at Harvard. And so by making this distinction between evolutionary biology and functional biology, he's kind of privileging the position of evolutionary theory, specifically as it's developed around organismal biology, in his case in animal systematics. Meyer also, at this point, is starting to become very interested in philosophy. Okay? Aside from being one of the greatest biologists of the 20th century, we remember him for starting History of Biology, and also he was a major figure in establishing philosophy of biology. And he was really adamantly opposed with the philosophy of science that existed at the time that saw physics as the model. Okay, and so what he wanted to do was to establish a new philosophy of biology that was founded on evolutionary theory. Okay, and so that was all tied in with this argument that he was making. Okay, so before leaving this, I think that his argument in some ways is unsatisfactory, and at least in the sense of how you he's made these distinctions. Now, how do you put them back together again? And I think his argument is wanting there, but it has a surprising point of of a point where I think unification could have been argued for in the concept of homeostasis. Meyer was a big fan of homeostasis, particularly during the early 1960s. And so in this paper, he discusses homeostasis and feedback as being just kind of a general concept that's applicable at any level in biological discourse. And so we think of homeostasis as a phenomena involved with maintaining constancy in physiological systems in organisms. But for Meyer, it was also a process that held species together. So he talked about genetic homeostasis, the teamwork of the genes in the genome that held species together against the forces of local adaptation. Okay? So in both of these senses, I think Meyer's interpretation of homeostasis is conservative. Okay? It's conservative in the sense that it maintains constancy in the organism. It's conservative in the sense that it holds species together against this kind of centrifugal force of local adaptation. All right. By the physiological ecologist George Bartholomew. Okay? Along with Irving and Scholander, who I'm going to get back to in a minute or two, Bartholomew is perhaps the most prominent figure in the development of physiological ecology in the United States. And more than the other two, I think he was interested in kind of the broader philosophical issues of scientific methodology. I'm going to contrast his position with that of Meyer, but before I do that, I want to point out that they had a lot in common with one another. So Bartholomew was initially trained in natural history museums, where Meyer made his home. Okay? They were both very interested in organisms as the focus of biology. And like Meyer, Bartholomew had a really deep identification with natural history. Okay? He liked to refer to himself as an experimental naturalist. So I think that they were kindred spirits in a number of ways. In other ways, I think that they were quite different from one another, at least in emphasis. So for Bartholomew, what he's really worried about is what he refers to as tunnel vision, this tendency in modern biology for people to become very narrowly specialized. And so he argues that on an individual level, not disciplines, but on an individual level, the successful biologist has to move up and down levels in the biological hierarchy. I think he talks about how you have to do this continuously and simultaneously. Okay? He doesn't have this defensiveness against the physical sciences the way Meyer did. So during World War II, Bartholomew was working on his PhD at Harvard, but he gets drafted into the Navy and does research in a physics laboratory working on mine warfare. And so he's introduced to instrumentation, and at least partly through that, I think he has an affinity for physics and chemistry that certainly Ernst Mayr did not have. So I certainly don't want to present Bartholomew as some sort of romantic figure that believes that somehow you can be a Renaissance person and be able to grasp, all fields in biology. In fact, he recognizes the difficulty of moving up and down the biological hierarchy. In fact, he sees this as just an impossible problem for a biologist to give a complete explanation of any sort of biological phenomenon. And he talks about how the successful biologist has to have intellectual brutality. You have to go into problems with the understanding that they're insurmountable, but nonetheless you have to tackle them in this kind of holistic way. So I think that's a different sort of emphasis than Myers, Proximate, and ultimate distinctions that are made. So at the risk of oversimplifying things, I have both graphs and tables in this talk. So this, I think, just kind of summarizes differences, but again, I'm not talking about absolute distinctions. I think these are differences in emphasis in the views of the two biologists. So now let me turn back to Irving and Scholander and Ernst Mayr and this controversy that they have. And I'm going to use these kind of two models of scientific methodology as a lens to kind of examine this controversy and maybe to kind of in retrospect ask why it was so difficult to apply these models to this case. So the controversy surrounds biogeographical rules. The best known is Bergmann's rule. Sometimes it was referred to as Bergmann's law. And so, at least in the northern hemisphere, if you take a transect from south to north and look at a taxonomic group, the average body size tends to increase from warmer to colder regions. Okay? And this was very important for Mayr for three reasons. First of all, he was an animal systematist. And so he argued that Bergmann's rule was a really important tool for taxonomists in terms of identifying subspecies. Okay? And so you could use the decline in body size as a way of identifying populations belonging to subspecies within a larger species. Okay? He also argued that declines were a proof of natural selection, even though an indirect proof. Okay? And so how can you get this sort of directional change? Well, natural selection is the only evolutionary mechanism that can explain that, according to Mayr. And finally, he argues that Bergmann's rule is a good example of homeostasis. Okay, so why are more northerly birds, why do they tend to be larger than those in warmer climates? Well, Mayr argues, based on a long tradition in 19th century physiology, that as animals get bigger, the ratio of their surface area to volume decreases. And so heat is produced in the body, in the volume, and is lost through the surface area. And so if you're making that ratio smaller, that ought to be adaptive in terms of maintaining body temperature in cold regions, and conversely, the inverse would work in populations in southern regions. Okay? This is also a good example of homeostasis at the species level. Okay? Because we have these populations of birds that are adapting to local circumstances. It's tending to tear apart the species. Okay? What holds the species together? Well, this genetic homeostasis, this conservative force that's counteracting local variation, local adaptation. And so there's a balance between those two forces, a kind of a homeostatic balance. Now, so before I get to Scholander and his critique of this position, let me point out that it would seem that this would be a really good case for applying those distinctions between proximate causation and ultimate causation. Okay? But Meyer doesn't really do that. He kind of blurs the two by applying this concept of homeostasis both as part of proximate functional physiology and part of ultimate evolutionary physiology without really distinguishing between the two uses. There's a little bit of hand waving that's going on there. So Scholander is just scathingly critical of this idea that by increasing body size, by decreasing the ratio of surface area to volume, that you can affect thermal regulation. Okay? And he is critical of this on three different bases. Philosophically, he is opposed to the idea that somehow these are rules or laws, at least in the sense that physicists talk about laws. Okay? At best, these are kind of rules of thumb because there are all sorts of exceptions. Okay? Not Bergman's rule doesn't apply to all species. Okay? Methodologically, he is critical of Meyer and other biogeographers because it's so difficult to measure surface area of an organism. Okay? So when we teach biology and we teach ratios between surface area and volume, we always use cubes or spheres or something. But measuring the surface area of a bird is really hard to do with any precision, and it's particularly hard to do if you're not using a living bird, if you're using a stuffed bird in a museum collection. And so methodologically, Scholander argues that this is just not great science. Okay? And finally, physiologically, he says it just doesn't make sense. We're not talking about huge differences in size here, and the small sizes along these lines just aren't going to have much influence on thermal regulation in birds and mammals. And in fact, there are lots of other physiological mechanisms that are much more important in the metabolic economy of birds and mammals. And so, particularly the last criticism is an outgrowth of the research that Scholander and Irving have been doing up at Point Barrow, Alaska. And so Scholander, at least in retelling this story, claims that his interest in this general area of adaptive physiology comes from observing the sled dogs that are sleeping out on the snowbanks in sub-zero weather in the middle of the winter when they've placed shelter boxes near the lab for the dogs to sleep in. So if the problem is staying warm, why aren't the dogs in the shelter boxes? Why are they lying out in the snow? Okay, and so staying warm is a problem, but it's not the only problem that these animals are facing. And so Irving and Scholander are really interested in this concept of heterothermy, which certainly wasn't new with them, but I think they applied it much more broadly than other physiologists had. And so if you look at the sled dog and measure temperature at different parts of the body, it varies greatly, okay? And partly that is due to necessity. So noses and paws don't work very well if they have a thick coating of fur. But it's also adaptive in the sense that areas that are poorly insulated act as heat radiators, okay? And so the dog uses a combination of physiology and behavior to maintain thermal regulation. When it's sleeping, it curls up and protects those poorly insulated areas. When it's active, it actually has to dissipate heat. And so the legs that are comparatively poorly insulated actually act as radiators for getting rid of excess heat. So birds and mammals are these kind of complex machines that generate and dissipate heat and balance the two, but not through a number of mechanisms, insulation being the most important one, but of course some Arctic birds and mammals have counter-current exchange mechanisms, and they have fat with a lower melting point. They have nerves that conduct nerve transmission at low temperatures compared with more temperate birds and mammals. So they have this complex array of adaptations that allow them to survive in the Arctic. All right, so size is important. So here's my graph. So we have, on this logarithmic scale, we have the weight of the animal, and on the two y-axes, we have two different ways of measuring insulation. And so for really small mammals, you simply can't have enough insulation to keep you warm. It's physically impossible to have a thick enough coat of fur to do that. So very small mammals, according to Scholander, have to seek protection during the winter. They're underneath the snow, or they're in burrows, staying warm in piles of caribou fur and whatnot. And so at this end of the scale, as we increase size, we increase the length of insulating hair, but fairly, at a fairly small size, that seems to stop being important. And so there's a lot of variation there, but a red fox has about as much insulation as a polar bear or a moose. Okay. There's another graph. So here, looking at the thermoneutral zone of Arctic mammals and comparing them with tropical mammals, Scholander managed to talk Irving into getting him a military plane to fly down to Panama to make some measurements of tropical mammals to make this a truly comparative study. But what's in this graph, actually, in one form or another, is still reproduced in ecology textbooks today. But So, what's important for Scholander and Irving is that compared with tropical mammals, it's not just that Arctic mammals have their thermoneutral zone shifted downward, but it's broadened. And even small mammals, through a fairly modest increase in metabolism, can deal with some of the lowest temperatures found on Earth. Okay, these are extrapolations actually given the facilities they had at Point Barrow. Irving and Scholander couldn't get these animals to shiver. Okay, and so they did later follow-up studies with more sophisticated environmental chambers. But so this doesn't disprove Meyer's argument that the explanation for Bergmann's rule lies in the relationship between surface area and volume. But it certainly weakens that argument. So if you want to know how this field develops in later years, you can try and talk to Brian McNabb, who is an expert on it. Just in kind of concluding my discussion, I'd like to kind of ask this retrospective question of why there was a controversy in the first place. Okay, so with Meyer's distinction between proximate and ultimate causation, it would seem to me that would find application in sorting out the different parts of this question. Okay, maybe even pointing to areas of potential cooperation between physiological ecologists, okay, and evolutionary biologists. Perhaps in suggesting ways that if surface area and volume aren't the explanation for Bergmann's rule, what is the proximate explanation for that regularity? Okay? And in fact, that doesn't happen. So Meyer and Scholander have this exchange of papers in evolution that's followed by other papers by Irving and a number of other biologists. In his big book, Animal Species and Evolution, Meyer repeatedly comes back to this issue in several places in the book. And finally, when he writes his history of biology, the growth of biological thought, Scholander and Irving are written out of the history. They don't appear at all. In fact, physiological ecology doesn't appear at all in that book, except for Knut Schmidt-Nielsen, who Meyer identifies as a biogeographer. Characters. Okay. On the other hand, if we look at Bartholomew's kind of unity of science perspective, certainly Scholander would be kind of a poster child for that approach. He had a very broad background in biology and was able to move, at least to some extent, up and down from kind of physical explanations up to organismal and explanations. But what he couldn't do was to see the importance of populations, the importance of individual variation, the importance of natural selection, which I think he simply assumed was operating. But aside from this very broad sort of evolutionary focus on adaptation, I think there wasn't much of an attempt to unify that with the sort of evolution that Meyer was doing. Okay. So the last conclusion has something to do with perennial problems of integration and synthesis, which maybe would better be left to discussion and questions and whatnot. But I would point out, before I came down, I was rereading Betty's book, Unifying Biology, and I think she had a really good point to make in the context of this proximate ultimate distinction. She said that unifying biology is not a static goal, it's a process. And so the goal of unifying biology using the modern synthesis was one attempt at this. I would argue that what the physiological ecologists were doing was another attempt at this. There was a little bit of overlap, but perhaps not as much as what one might have thought was possible, at least in retrospective. And certainly, I think this is a continual challenge that biologists of every generation face, the idea that somehow we can unify the diverse sort of sub-disciplines is something that we all would like to do, but it's a process, maybe not an achievable goal.
Yeah. Thank you. Could actually do Evo Devo in the context of this too, of this.
Well, I'm struck that to the extent Myra was arguing for physiological to ecological to evolutionary, and Bartholomew from cells, individuals to ecosystems, in some sense they were both arguing for moving across scales in time or space or organismal size.
Yeah.
And it seemed like at least Bartholomew recognized that our explanation or mechanism, which most of us still don't think about, is scale dependent.
Yeah.
But then Meyer didn't. But they do seem to have that similarity in terms of moving from seconds to the extent these disciplines vary.
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't argue that their positions are diametrically opposed. But I do think that, I mean, there's a contrast with Meyer's kind of approach of making these dichotomous distinctions. I mean, once you do that, you have to kind of, I think that you have to give an explanation of how they get brought back together if you're making a unification argument. And Bartholomew seems to have this view that individual biologists, at least really creative individual biologists, are kind of able to do all of this at the same time, or that's what you should be striving to do. So you are thinking about physiological mechanisms and what's going on in populations and how organisms are parts of their ecosystem. You're doing that at the same time and all the time, and that has to be part of the method that you're using. And I do think those are kind of two different emphases.
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest, I didn't disagree with anything you said, right? It was just, I find it curious that looked at another way, they could both put their challenges in some respects in terms of, for example, moving across scales and time.
Yeah.
Brian?
Two questions or two comments. One of them is on Bergman's rule. And I think the Scholander was far on target than was Meyer. Part of the problem is when you express everything on a per gram basis, which was the basis for the value of getting large, because they have a lower per gram metabolic rate than they do if they're small, simply because metabolic rate is proportional to the 2/3 or 1/3, I mean 2/3 or 3/4 power, whatever it is. So if you divide by mass to the first power, the relationship will become negative. But I think that I would be tempted to say that no animal lives on a per gram basis except animals that are 1 gram. This is an artificial, mathematical reasonable conclusion, but it really doesn't point out. Speaking about graphs, let me put a graph on the board, which I think gets at what is going on. If we plot body size, and you can do it by mass or you can do it by whatever way you want, and as a function of latitude. There's some really interesting information. In the New World, that's the size of jaguars. They occupy sort of from the southern United States to northern Argentina, and they have no correlation with body size and latitude. If you look at mountain lions are like that. Two Bergman's rules. Bergman's rule in the southern hemisphere, Bergman's rule in the northern hemisphere. This is competitive exclusion. If you look at the prey size used by jaguars, the prey size of jaguars is highly variable, but it's something like that. They have the big prey. In the same areas, the mountain lions have small prey. But in the absence of jaguars, the prey goes up in pumas, and it goes up in both latitudes. So what they're doing is dividing the environment up by resources. So I think that Bergman's rule is a resource rule, not a metabolism rule. And you can also show this in other groups, weasels, for example. If a big weasel will have, in the northern hemisphere, will have a more southern-northern limit than will smaller weasels. But the smaller weasels, farther north than the end of the distribution of the bigger weasel, the smaller weasels get larger. Again, dividing up the environment depending upon circumstances. And in the pumas, for example, in the northern hemisphere, the prey that they feed on gets larger and larger as you go further north. So they're feeding on white-tailed deer, then they go to mule deer, and then they go to moose and elk and things like that as the further north you go. They're changing food resources. One other comment is on proximate versus ultimate. There is, in a way, intellectually that difference, but I don't think it's an absolute difference. And I think that if you do certain kinds of work on, say, physiological ecology, the proximate is a much easier thing to answer than is the ultimate. That is, you can figure out the mechanics by which you can get a particular result, but the question is, why do you get that result? So these are two separate questions, and one of the problems in analyses, it seems to me, is people often mix these two questions together to pretend it's one question. And a good example of that is this controversy over phylogenetic analysis versus other analyses. And the phylogenetic analysis is telling you about the history of the evolution in of character states in particular groups. But that question is entirely different from the question as to what do those characteristics do. One is an evolutionary question, the other is a physiological, ecological question. So for example, it makes no difference where frugivory comes from in a phylogeny, because frugivory does not have the same effect in all the groups that have evolved frugivory. It makes, if you're on an island and you're a frugivore, you have a lower metabolic rate. If you're a large mammal and you're a frugivore, you have a low metabolic rate. If you are in altitude, if you're a frugivore, you have a higher metabolic. So the expression of character states depends not only on the other properties of a species, but also the environmental context in which they occur.
Anyway. Just from a historical perspective, it seems to me that in a lot of cases, the really interesting questions are at the interface between that proximate causation and ultimate causation. I think if you look at Meyer's work, for example, that's certainly true. But if you granted that the distinctions might be important, you might ask, well, why didn't you just say to Scholander, fine, I give up on the proximate causation, you go off and do that. I'm interested in using this generalization in my taxonomy and as part of my evolutionary biology, but he holds on to this kind of antiquated view of thermal regulation. And I don't know exactly why he does that. I'm not enough of a Meyer scholar that he might have ideas about that.
I'll end with them.
Okay.
We've got a pile of questions, and you had your hand raised.
You're not looking at me?
No, yeah, and then Bob, and then Jane.
I was curious as far as the role that Vanderbush played here in the post-World War II era, as far as funding for science. You know, was Meyer connected with him in any way or not?
I think Meyer less than Irving. Yeah. I mean, I think that I mean, the laboratory was funded initially by the Office of Naval Research, and a lot of this physiological ecology, I think, developed within that Cold War context, funding. I mean, it was an easy transition, right? These guys had been working during the war. They were part of the armed services, and they made all these connections with Washington. And after the war, you know, the money would just kind of poured in to continue this less applied sort of research. And the Office of Naval Research wasn't really interested directly in strategic sorts of research necessarily. They were interested in funding biologists and
Well, but still,
chemists
the
and
physicists
physicists.
were in the high of
Yeah.
the pecking order.
Yeah.
And biologists were below them at that time.
Yep. I would say that's true, but I mean, in the Irving archives, there's a lot of his correspondence. I don't know if he has any correspondence with Vanderbush, but certainly with officials in Washington trying to argue for expanding this laboratory, and eventually he does. You know, there's a big Arctic Institute at the University of Alaska that kind of goes back to Irving's work.
So, I had just a quick thought. You started out talking about Ernst Mayr and George Bartholomew as both being concerned with the status of organismal biology at the time of around 1960. Here we are, almost 60 years later, and we still have that same problem. Around the country, if you go department to department, you'll find animal behavior, functional morphology, physiological ecology, and a number of things that are focused at the level of individual organisms viewed as holistic units are waning away. And I think that's a serious problem, both scientifically and educationally. Where do you find the ologies taught, mammalogy, ornithology, and so forth? It's almost only in places that have, sometimes in liberal arts colleges, but it's mainly places with museums, you know? I think this is a real problem. So it hadn't gone away, that's for sure.
No.
I think it's interesting to think about another person who was writing similar things right at that same time was Nico Tinbergen. And Tinbergen kind of combined the two of them. So he referenced Meyer. I don't know whether he referenced Bartholomew or not, but he added in, so he had the proximate mechanisms divided into two things. One was the sort of physiological, immediate causes, and then he had developmental mechanisms. And then he distinguished between adaptation, adaptiveness of behavior, and the history of behavior in a population. So he actually made that distinction, and I think his paper was like 63 or 64, something like that. And his point was that the complete study of any behavior requires all four of those answers to all four of those questions, all four of those determinants of behavior. So he was thinking right from the very beginning about the integration of the field. It's funny to me that that is not, to this day, it completely permeates my field, animal behavior. But it doesn't seem to have permeated other fields and that sort of concept of there being an integration necessary. I mean, you have to have proximate and ultimate to understand behavior. There's no other way. You have to have development, and you have to have evolutionary history. So they are real. He is really, Tinbergen really had that notion of integration together right there in 1964.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I would just follow it up with the comment that this idea of integration in biology is really widespread at this time. And I'm not a social historian, so but there would be a fascinating story if you could document it about this. I mean, in Meyer's paper, it's a short 5-page paper. He uses the term integration 5 times. And if you look in Bartholomew's papers, it's there all the time, and Tinbergen's using it, and so this, and these people don't talk, at least the ones that I'm familiar with, they don't talk about sort of the broader social context of what they're working in, so is the fact that this is a civil rights movement in the United States and in Europe. They're talking about an integrated Europe. Is that somehow influencing the way people think about a fragmented biology and bringing it together? I don't know of anybody that talks that way explicitly.
I have a paper on Stebbins called Confession of a Molecular Botanist, and it's G. Ledyard Stebbins, Developmental Genetics and the Origins of Integrative Biology. I have no doubt that, what I say is the language of synthesis. People sort of diminish the use of the term synthesis in the 60s and begin to talk about integration. And the paper is framed by a photograph of Ledyard as the image of Berkeley. And you can see in the 1967 centennial that they have. And if you look at the photograph, your hair stands on end, because you'll see him surrounded by students of color. And the message, it's an Ansel Adams photograph. It is so extraordinary. And they all, at Berkeley, they had a reading group called the Integrative Studies of Biology Reading Group. This is Berkeley. I don't need influence here and there. These are discourses, these are languages people are hearing, and they're using these terms, and they're moving towards, bringing all of biology together around what will become in the 1990s, right? Integrative biology. That's where it begins. It's the first department. Anyways, I didn't want to take over. Yes, we need the Bartholomew. By the way, Harvey Lillywhite is a Bartholomew student. I should have you know.
So I just want to add a humorous insight about Bartholomew, but first I'd like to, emphasize that primarily what was important about his perspective was that no matter what level of biology you worked at, it was important to think broadly, to have breadth of knowledge, and to have a perspective, so you don't, make misjudgments, and you can better understand what you're working with. And although I think one could fairly say that he was in many ways the father of physiological ecology, Bartholomew published evolutionary papers. He was very perceptive in terms of animal behavior, published behavioral papers, and so on. But anyway, the humorous thing is, later in his career, I remember he said to me once, he said, I've spent my entire career looking for general rules for things. And then he said, but basically what I've learned is that every animal is different.
That's the beauty of biology.
And that's really an important thing, too.
Yes,
Okay, so let me just close with the question I've got, which you can't answer, but it's a reflective question. How does a guy who works on the birds of Melanesia, a book that he doesn't even bring out until the end of his life, really, what was Ernst Mayer's actual day-to-day work, right? What was it? How does he come to speak for the whole of biology? And why is it that he plays this role of being the defender? And you know, if I were to write my next paper, it would be on the great fights of Ernst Mayr. There's like 6 or 7 of these instances where he's taking on people like the exobiologist, Carl Woese, George Wald, I can't tell you how, the anthropologist, right? He hated molecular anthropology. What's he doing in molecular anthropology? What is he doing taking on these areas as they're being introduced? It fascinates me because this is what he does all through the 60s, late 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he comes to take on the role of being, you know, the spokesperson for this unified integrative biology. And of course, let me just close by thanking you very much for coming. There's a reception at my house. It's behind the schizophrenic Bergman's room. It's right here. You're all welcome to come, and I think it's very useful to think historically. Every time that I see a kind of a debate or an argument, something happening in the biological sciences, I sort of am amused and really intrigued, because if you look at it, usually the different sides are partially correct. You know, it's all on this trajectory, and this process of this unification takes a lot of struggle, and it doesn't come easy. So when you see these disputes and debates, and many of them are just fruitless, learn your history and realize, you know, they have a way of, you know, get over it. They will. I mean, you will have some kind of rectification take place. So thank you for coming, and thank